Steve Harrison had everything money could buy, except the one thing it couldn't replace. Every night, at exactly 7, he sat in the same spot on the leather couch. Same channel, same volume, same silence. The television spoke, but no one listened. The mansion was enormous, too enormous for one man. The walls were lined with framed memories of a life that no longer existed. A wedding photo, a vacation smile frozen in time, a woman who used to sit beside him, now gone. 2 years since her funeral. 2 years since the house went quiet. His children called from overseas, urging him to move closer, to start again. But Steve couldn't leave. This house still breathed her presence. Every corner whispered her name. Then, on a morning no different from the rest, something unexpected happened. A child walked into his living room. Small footsteps, a soft voice, and a baseball cap that stopped Steve's heart cold. Because grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it waits patiently, until the smallest moment forces it into the light. And on that day, in an empty living room built for love, laughter was about to return, from the last place Steve ever expected. If this story is touching your heart, don't watch it alone. Like this video, subscribe to Speak Black Stories, and stay with us. Because some stories heal more than one life. The alarm never went off anymore. Steve Harrison woke at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before it was supposed to ring. He had stopped setting it 6 months ago when he realized his body had memorized the routine so completely that the sound had become unnecessary. Like so many things in his life now, unnecessary, automatic, empty. He lay still in the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling fan that rotated slowly in the pre-dawn darkness. The other side of the bed remained perfectly made, untouched. He hadn't slept on that side since the funeral. Couldn't bring himself to disturb the decorative pillows she had arranged with such care. The ones with the embroidered patterns she'd spent an entire summer selecting. The house was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes with contentment, but the heavy, suffocating silence that presses against your chest and reminds you that you are utterly, completely alone. Steve pushed himself up, his joints protesting with the familiar ache of 65 years. The bedroom was enormous, decorated in soft creams and blues that his wife, Margaret, had chosen during their last renovation. She had been so excited about the skylights, the walk-in closet, the reading nook by the window where morning light would pour in. "Imagine all the Sunday mornings we'll spend here," she had said, her eyes bright with plans they would never fulfill. He shuffled to the bathroom, avoiding his reflection in the mirror. He knew what he would see. A man who had aged a decade in 2 years. Gray hair that had gone fully white, eyes that had lost their spark, a face that had forgotten how to smile. The shower was quick, mechanical. Dress in the same style of clothes he always wore. Slacks, a button-down shirt, a cardigan that hung a bit looser than it used to. He had lost weight. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, worried about it constantly, preparing elaborate meals he barely touched. Downstairs, the mansion revealed itself in all its excessive grandeur. The foyer with its crystal chandelier, the formal dining room with a table that seated 16. The library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves Margaret had filled with first editions. The kitchen with professional-grade appliances that now only Mrs. Chen used. And the living room. The living room was where Steve spent most of his time now. It was the largest room in the house, with high ceilings, expensive artwork on the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured gardens. Two leather couches faced each other across a glass coffee table. A 75-inch television hung on the wall like a shrine to modern excess. This was where they had watched baseball together. Margaret hadn't cared about baseball when they first met. She'd called it boring. Couldn't understand why grown men got so worked up over a game. But Steve had grown up in Chicago, had been a Cubs fan since he was 6 years old, had lived through decades of disappointment until that magical 2016 season when they finally won the World Series. "Just watch one game with me," he had begged during their second year of marriage. She had rolled her eyes but agreed, and somehow, inexplicably, she had fallen in love with it. Not just the game, but the ritual of it, the way they would order takeout and sit side by side, shouting at the screen, groaning at bad calls, celebrating home runs like teenagers. She had started wearing his old Cubs cap around the house. The navy blue faded from years of sun exposure. It had become her thing. She would steal it from his closet, wear it while gardening, while reading, while cooking breakfast on Saturday mornings. "You look ridiculous," he would tease. "You love it," she would shoot back, grinning. And he did. God, he did. Now Steve sat alone on the left couch, his couch, at exactly 7 p.m. every evening. The television played whatever was on. He didn't really watch it. The sound was just noise to fill the crushing silence, a barrier against the thoughts that came when everything was too quiet. Mrs. Chen had tried, in those early months, to engage him in conversation, to ask about his day, to suggest activities, to gently push him toward something resembling life. But Steve had shut her down with polite but firm distance. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen. Thank you." His children, Michael in London, Sarah in Singapore, called every week, sometimes twice a week. They worried. They wanted him to move closer to one of them, to sell this house with all its memories, to start fresh somewhere new. "Dad, you can't just sit in that house alone," Michael had said during their last video call. "Mom wouldn't want this for you." Steve had felt anger flash through him, hot and sudden. "Don't tell me what your mother would want." Michael had gone quiet. Sarah, listening on the three-way call, had stepped in with her usual diplomatic tone. "We just want you to be happy, Dad. We want you to live, not just exist." But they didn't understand. Moving would mean abandoning the last place Margaret had been alive. It would mean packing up her things, erasing the physical evidence of her existence, pretending that starting over in a new city could somehow make the past 2 years disappear. This house was all he had left of her. The garden she had planted still bloomed every spring. The books she had organized still lined the shelves in alphabetical order. The coffee mug she had used every morning still sat in the cabinet, unwashed, because Steve couldn't bear to touch it. So he stayed. And every evening, he sat in the living room, in the exact spot where they used to sit together, and he pretended to watch television, while really just counting the hours until he could go back upstairs and lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, waiting for another day to begin. The only disruption to this routine was David. David was his driver, hired 8 months ago when Steve's doctor had suggested he shouldn't be driving himself to medical appointments anymore. Steve had resisted at first. He didn't need help, didn't want a stranger in his space, but eventually the practicality of it had won out. David was quiet, professional, punctual. A black man in his mid-40s with close-cropped hair starting to gray at the temples. He drove a sleek black sedan, opened doors without being asked, and never pried into Steve's life. They exchanged pleasantries about traffic and weather, nothing more. It was exactly what Steve wanted. No connection, no complications, no risk of having to feel anything beyond the bare minimum required for polite interaction. But soon, that was about to change, because David had a son, and that son was about to walk into Steve's carefully controlled world, wearing a baseball cap that would shatter everything. David Porter had learned early in life that some jobs required silence more than skill. Driving for Mr. Harrison was one of those jobs. The pay was exceptional, far better than the previous position he'd held driving for a tech startup CEO who had treated him like a combination chauffeur-therapist assistant. Mr. Harrison was different. He barely spoke, never asked personal questions, got in the car, stated the destination, and spent the entire drive staring out the window or checking his phone. At first, David had found it unsettling. Was he doing something wrong? Should he make conversation, try to build rapport? But his buddy Marcus, who had worked in private service for years, had set him straight over beers one night. Rich people in mourning are a specific breed, Marcus had explained. They don't want your pity, don't want your conversation, don't want you treating them like they're fragile. They want competence and invisibility. You do that, you'll keep the job forever. So David had become invisible. He arrived every morning at exactly 8:45 a.m., parked in the circular driveway of the massive estate, and waited. Mr. Harrison would emerge at 9 o'clock a.m. sharp, dressed in his usual cardigan and slacks, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison." "Good morning, David." The same exchange every day. Then the destination, doctor's office, or bank, or occasionally just drive for a while. Those last requests were the saddest. David would drive through the wealthy neighborhoods, past parks and waterfronts, while Mr. Harrison sat in the back seat and stared at nothing. Sometimes David would catch his reflection in the rear-view mirror and see a man who looked utterly lost, like he was searching for something he knew he'd never find. David understood loss, though he never spoke about it with Mr. Harrison. 3 years ago, his ex-wife, Keisha, had died in a car accident. They had been divorced for 2 years by then, sharing custody of their son, Jason, trying to maintain a functional co-parenting relationship despite the marriage falling apart. The divorce had been messy, but necessary. They had married too young, wanted different things, fought constantly. But her death had devastated him anyway, not because he still loved her romantically, but because she had been Jason's mother. Because their son, only 7 years old at the time, had lost the person who tucked him in at night when he stayed at her apartment, the person who made his favorite pancakes, the person who knew exactly how to calm him down when he got overwhelmed. David had suddenly become a single father full-time, navigating grief he barely understood while trying to help his son process something no child should have to face. Jason had handled it in his own way. He had cried, raged, withdrawn for months. But slowly, with therapy and time, and David's unwavering presence, the boy had found his way back to joy. Not the same joy as before, something quieter, more aware, but joy nonetheless. Now Jason was 10, bright and curious, obsessed with space and dinosaurs and baseball. He lived with David during the week and spent weekends with Keisha's mother, his grandmother Rita, who doted on him with the fierce love of someone who had also lost a daughter. David's life had become a careful balance of work, parenting, and making sure Jason never doubted for a second that he was loved. The driving job with Mr. Harrison had been a blessing. The hours were predictable. The pay allowed him to afford a decent apartment and Jason's after-school programs. And the emotional distance meant David could show up, do his job, and go home without carrying anyone else's pain. He had enough of his own. But then came the email from his supervisor at the driving service. Reminder: annual Bring Your Child to Work Day is next Thursday. All employees are encouraged to participate. Please notify your clients in advance. David had stared at the email for a long time. Jason had been asking about it for weeks. His school friend's dad worked at an office building and had brought him last year, and Jason had come home full of questions. "Dad, can I come to your work? I want to see what you do." David had deflected, knowing that bring your child to work didn't really apply when your work was driving a grieving widower around town. But now the company was making it official, encouraging participation. He would have to ask Mr. Harrison. The next morning, David prepared his request carefully. He waited until they were heading back from a doctor's appointment, the car gliding through tree-lined streets in the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to ask about something." "Yes?" The older man's voice was neutral, professional. "Next Thursday is Bring Your Child to Work Day with the driving service. I have a 10-year-old son, and I was wondering if it would be all right if he accompanied me that day. He would stay in the car, of course. He's very well behaved, and I've explained he needs to be quiet and respectful." There was a long pause. David watched in the rearview mirror as Mr. Harrison considered this, his expression unreadable. "How old did you say?" "10, sir." Another pause. "That's fine, David, as long as he understands this isn't a social visit." "Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate it." The conversation ended there. David felt relieved but also anxious. Jason was a good kid, but he was also energetic, curious, prone to asking questions at inappropriate moments. David would need to prepare him carefully. That night, after dinner, David sat Jason down at their small kitchen table. "Buddy, I got permission for you to come with me to work next Thursday." Jason's face lit up. "Really? Yes. Can I see the car? Is it fancy?" "It is pretty fancy," David admitted, smiling. "But here's the thing. The man I drive for is very private. He lost his wife a couple years ago and he's still sad about it. So when you're with me, you need to be really quiet and respectful. No running around, no touching things, no asking a bunch of questions. Can you do that?" Jason nodded solemnly. "I promise, Dad. I'll be super good." "I know you will." Jason hesitated, then asked, "Did his wife die like Mom did?" David's chest tightened. "I don't know exactly what happened, buddy. But yeah, he's grieving like we were." "Is he still sad?" "Yeah, I think he is." Jason was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "Maybe seeing a kid will make him feel a little better. Kids are usually good at making people smile." David pulled his son into a hug, overwhelmed by his beautiful, hopeful heart. "Maybe, buddy. Maybe." But David didn't really believe it. Mr. Harrison didn't seem like a man who could be reached by childish joy or innocent questions. He seemed like a man who had sealed himself off completely, who had decided that feeling nothing was better than feeling everything. Still, Jason's optimism was hard to resist. And as Thursday approached, David found himself hoping, just a little, that maybe his son was right. Maybe a child who understood loss but chose happiness anyway was exactly what Mr. Harrison needed, even if neither of them knew it yet. Thursday morning arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth for April. Jason had been awake since 6 a.m., too excited to sleep, trying on different outfits to decide what looked most professional for his first day at work with his dad. David had smiled at the effort. Khaki pants, a button-up shirt that Jason insisted made him look businesslike, and sneakers that he had carefully cleaned the night before. "How do I look, Dad?" Jason had asked, standing at attention in the hallway. "Like a professional," David had answered, straightening his son's collar. "Remember what we talked about?" "Yes, quiet, respectful, no questions. Stay in the car unless you say it's okay." "Good. And what else?" Jason had paused, thinking. "Oh, and I brought my book to read so I won't be bored." David had glanced at the book tucked under his son's arm, a thick paperback about space exploration. "Perfect. Let's go." But as they headed out the door, Jason had run back to his room. "Forgot something." He emerged moments later wearing his baseball cap, a navy blue Cubs cap that was slightly too big for him. The brim curved and faded from sun exposure. It had been Keisha's. David felt his throat tighten. Keisha had been a Cubs fan, had watched games religiously, had worn that cap constantly during the summer. After she died, Rita had given it to Jason as something to remember his mother by. "You sure you want to wear that today?" David had asked gently. "Yeah, it's my good luck hat." How could David argue with that? They arrived at Mr. Harrison's estate at 8:45 a.m. exactly. The mansion looked even more imposing in the morning light, a sprawling two-story structure with perfectly maintained grounds, tall windows that reflected the sky, and an overall air of wealth so profound it felt almost aggressive. Jason's eyes widened. "Whoa. Dad, this guy must be really rich." "He is. But remember, we're here to work, not gawk." I know. Mr. Harrison emerged at 9:00 a.m. as always, his movements slow and deliberate. David got out to open the door, but paused. "Mr. Harrison, this is my son, Jason. Jason, say hello." Jason stepped forward, polite and nervous. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for letting me come to work with my dad today." Mr. Harrison barely glanced at him. "Good morning." That was it. No smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement. He climbed into the back seat, and David gestured for Jason to get in the front passenger seat. They drove in silence. David had warned Jason, but the quiet was still awkward. Jason clutched his book, occasionally sneaking glances at the fancy interior of the car. The leather seats, the polished wood accents, the subtle technology built into every surface. Their first stop was the bank. Mr. Harrison disappeared inside for 20 minutes while David and Jason waited in the car. "He seems really sad," Jason whispered. "I told you, buddy, and that's why we're being respectful and giving him space." Yeah. The day continued like that. Another appointment at a lawyer's office. A stop at a pharmacy. Each time, Mr. Harrison would emerge, climb back into the car, and say nothing beyond the next destination. By early afternoon, David could tell Jason was getting restless despite his best efforts. The book could only hold his attention for so long. "Dad, can we get lunch?" Jason whispered. David checked his watch. Mr. Harrison usually went home around this time. "Mr. Harrison, are there any other stops or should I take you home?" "Home is fine." They drove back to the estate. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Mr. Harrison spoke again. "David, I have a delivery coming later. Would you be able to wait for it and bring it inside? I'm expecting a package around 3. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. No problem." Good, you can wait in the house rather than the car. David blinked in surprise. In 8 months of working for Mr. Harrison, he had never been invited inside except to carry in groceries on occasion. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mr. Harrison got out of the car and headed toward the front door. David looked at Jason. Looks like we're going inside for a bit. Jason's eyes went wide. Inside that huge house? Yep, but remember the rules? I remember. They followed Mr. Harrison into the mansion. The foyer was breathtaking. Marble floors, that massive chandelier, artwork that probably cost more than David's car. Jason stayed close to his father, intimidated by the grandeur. Mr. Harrison gestured vaguely. You can wait in the living room. I'll be in my study. He disappeared down a hallway, leaving David and Jason standing in the enormous space. The living room was even more impressive than the foyer. High ceilings, expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The giant television on the wall. The perfectly arranged decorative items that suggested professional interior design. But what struck David most was how empty it felt. This wasn't a room people lived in. It was a showroom, a museum, a place preserved exactly as it had been, untouched and unloved. Jason wandered carefully around the room, looking but not touching, until something on one of the side tables caught his eye. A framed photograph. Mr. Harrison and a woman, his wife, presumably. They were at a baseball game, both wearing Cubs caps and jerseys, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from shared happiness. Dad, Jason whispered. He liked the Cubs too. David walked over to look at the photo. The woman in the picture was beautiful, with warm eyes and a bright smile. She was wearing the same kind of cap Jason was wearing now. Looks like it, David said quietly. Jason adjusted his own cap, looking at the photo with something like recognition. She looks nice. I'm sure she was. They settled onto one of the couches to wait for the delivery. Jason pulled out his book, but kept glancing around the room, taking everything in. David checked his phone, responding to a text from Rita about picking up Jason this weekend. About 20 minutes passed. The house remained silent except for the distant hum of appliances. Then Jason spoke up. Dad, I have to use the bathroom. David stood. All right, let me go ask Mr. Harrison where. No, it's okay. I saw one down that hallway when we came in. Jason, you can't just wander around someone's house. I'll be quick. Just to the bathroom and back, I promise. Before David could stop him, Jason had already headed toward the hallway. David started to follow, but his phone rang. Rita calling. He answered, keeping his voice low. Hey, Rita. Yeah, everything's good? Meanwhile, Jason found the bathroom, did his business, washed his hands carefully. On his way back, he got turned around. The hallways in this mansion were confusing, everything looking similar. He turned a corner and found himself in another hallway, then another. He was completely lost. Panic started to creep in. His dad had told him not to wander, and now he was lost in a rich man's house. Then he heard a voice, Mr. Harrison's voice, coming from a room with the door slightly open. Jason moved toward it, hoping to ask for directions back to the living room. He pushed the door open slightly and peered inside. Mr. Harrison was sitting at a large desk, his back to the door, talking on the phone. His voice was strained, heavy. I know, Michael. I know you're worried, but I can't leave this house. Everything that mattered is still here. Your mother is still here. Jason froze. He knew he shouldn't be listening, but he couldn't move. "I sit in that living room every night," Mr. Harrison continued, "and I can still see her sitting next to me. I can still hear her laugh. If I leave, I lose even that. I lose the last pieces of her." There was a long pause. "I'm not living, you say. Then what would you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, this is all that's left." Jason backed away from the door quietly, his heart pounding. He finally found his way back to the living room where David was just hanging up his phone. "There you are. I was about to send out a search party." "Sorry, Dad, I got lost." David ruffled his son's hair. "It's okay. Just sit tight now." Jason sat back down, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. Mr. Harrison sounded so sad, so alone. Jason understood that feeling. After his mom died, he had felt alone too, even with his dad and Grandma Rita trying so hard to make things better. He had spent months feeling like part of him was missing, like he would never be happy again. But somehow, he had found his way back, not to the same happiness as before, but to something new. Maybe Mr. Harrison just needed someone to remind him that it was possible. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. David went to accept the delivery, a large box that he brought into the foyer. He was about to call out to Mr. Harrison when the older man appeared from his study. "Thank you, David. You can leave that there." "No problem, Mr. Amaya." They stood awkwardly for a moment. David was about to excuse himself when Jason suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Harrison?" Both men turned to look at him. David's eyes widened in warning, but Jason continued. "Your car is ready, sir. Whenever you want to leave." It was an unnecessary statement. They were already home, and Mr. Harrison clearly wasn't going anywhere. But Jason had felt like he needed to say something, anything, to break the silence. Mr. Harrison looked at Jason for the first time all day. Really looked at him. And his eyes landed on the baseball cap. Navy blue, Cubs logo, faded from the sun. Exactly like the one Margaret used to wear. Mr. Harrison's face went completely still. All color drained from it. His breath caught audibly. Jason noticed the reaction and instinctively reached up to touch his cap. "Oh, sorry. Should I take this off inside? My dad always tells me to, but I forgot." "No." Mr. Harrison's voice came out rough, strangled. "No, it's fine." But his eyes stayed fixed on that cap. David saw what was happening and gently put a hand on Jason's shoulder. "Come on, buddy, let's head out." "Okay. Bye, Mr. Harrison. Thanks again for letting me visit." Mr. Harrison didn't respond. He was still staring at the cap, at this child standing in his foyer wearing the ghost of his wife's favorite accessory. As David and Jason left, Mr. Harrison stood frozen in his grand, empty foyer. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt something crack inside the wall he had built around his grief. A hairline fracture. Small, barely noticeable, but there. Steve Harrison couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, but instead of the usual blank numbness, his mind kept replaying the moment in the foyer. The child. The cap. The way the boy had looked at him with those bright, curious eyes, completely unaware of the earthquake he had triggered. It was just a cap. Thousands of Cubs fans wore them every day. It meant nothing. Except, it meant everything. Because for one suspended moment, Steve had seen Margaret standing there. Not literally, he wasn't losing his mind, but the echo of her was so strong it had knocked the breath from his lungs. The way she used to wear that cap tilted slightly to the side. The way she would adjust it when she was thinking. The way it had become such a part of her that seeing her without it had always looked strange. Steve got out of bed at 5 a.m., gave up on sleep entirely. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, but everything felt different, shifted, like the house itself had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. When David arrived at 8:45 a.m., Steve was surprised to see Jason in the passenger seat again. David lowered the window apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. Jason's grandmother had an emergency dental appointment this morning, so I had to bring him again. It won't happen regularly, I promise." Steve should have been annoyed. This was supposed to be a professional arrangement, not a family affair. But instead, he heard himself say, "It's fine, David." Jason waved from the front seat, wearing the cap again. They drove to Steve's doctor's appointment, a routine checkup he barely paid attention to. The doctor asked the usual questions about diet, exercise, sleep. Steve gave the usual vague answers that weren't quite lies, but weren't quite truth either. On the drive back, Jason broke the silence. "Mr. Harrison, can I ask you something?" David shot his son a warning look. "Jason, remember?" "It's all right," Steve said, surprising himself again. "What is it?" "That picture in your living room. Were you at a Cubs game?" Steve's throat tightened. "Yes, several years ago." "That's so cool. I've never been to a real game. Just watched on TV with my grandma. She loves the Cubs. This was her hat, actually. Well, first it was my mom's, but then when my mom died, Grandma gave it to me." The casual way Jason said it, "when my mom died," like he was mentioning the weather, hit Steve hard. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Jason, maybe we don't need to." "How long ago?" Steve asked. Jason turned in his seat to look back at him. 3 years ago, I was 7. She was in a car accident." "I'm sorry." "Thanks. It was really hard at first. I didn't want to do anything fun because it felt wrong to be happy when she wasn't here anymore. But my dad and my therapist helped me understand that Mom would want me to be happy. That being sad forever wouldn't bring her back." Steve stared at this 10-year-old child who was speaking with the wisdom of someone much older. "Do you still miss her?" Steve asked quietly. "Every day," Jason said simply. "But missing her doesn't mean I can't also have good days. My therapist said both things can be true at the same time." The car fell silent. David glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Steve's eye. There was something unspoken there, a recognition that this conversation was more significant than it appeared. When they arrived back at the estate, Steve made another impulsive decision. "Jason, would you like to come inside for a bit? I could use some help with something." David looked shocked. "Mr. Harrison, that's not necessary. We don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. I have some boxes in the garage that need to be moved. It would be helpful to have an extra set of hands." It was a flimsy excuse. Steve had a housekeeper who handled such things. But he found himself wanting this child to stay, wanting to understand how someone so young had managed to do what Steve couldn't, find a way to live alongside grief instead of being buried by it. They went into the garage, where indeed there were some old boxes that Mrs. Chen had been asking about for months. Steve pointed them out to Jason. "These need to go to the storage room off the kitchen. Think you can help carry them?" "Sure." Jason picked up a box that wasn't too heavy, and David took the larger ones. They made several trips, Steve directing them through the house. He caught Jason looking around with wide-eyed curiosity. "Your house is really big. Jason said. Do you ever get lost? Sometimes it feels like it, Steve admitted. Do you live here all alone? Jason, David warned. I do, Steve said. My children are grown. They live overseas. Don't you get lonely? David closed his eyes in mortification. Jason, that's enough questions. But Steve answered anyway. Yes, I do. Jason nodded like this made perfect sense. They finished moving the boxes, and Steve found himself inviting them to stay for lunch. Mrs. Chen was delighted to have someone to cook for besides Steve, who barely ate anything. She prepared sandwiches and fruit, setting them up in the kitchen's breakfast nook. It felt strange having people at the table. The kitchen was large enough to hold 20 people comfortably, but it had been just Steve and occasionally Mrs. Chen for so long that the sounds of conversation felt foreign. Jason talked, a lot, about school, about his favorite subjects, science and history, about the book he was reading about Mars exploration, about his friend Tyler who had a pet lizard, about how he wanted to learn guitar but his dad said they had to save up for one first. David tried multiple times to shush him, but Steve waved him off. It's fine. It's nice to hear about life. After lunch, as David prepared to leave, Jason paused at the door. Mr. Harrison, can I show you something? He pulled out his phone, a basic kid's smartphone with parental controls. He scrolled to a photo and held it up. It was a picture of a woman who must have been his mother. She was laughing at the camera, wearing a Cubs cap, holding a young Jason on her lap. That's my mom, Jason said. She was really funny. She used to make up silly songs about everything. Like she had a song about brushing teeth, and one about eating vegetables, and one about rainy days. My dad says I got my sense of humor from her. Steve looked at the photo. The woman did look joyful, the kind of person who brought light into rooms. She looks wonderful, Steve said. She was. And you know what? I'm really glad I've pictures like this. Because when I miss her, I can look at them and remember the good times instead of just being sad about her being gone. Steve felt something shift in his chest. This child was teaching him something he hadn't wanted to learn. That remembering could be more than pain. That the past didn't have to be a prison. That maybe, just maybe, honoring someone's memory meant trying to live the kind of life they would have wanted for you. After David and Jason left, Steve walked back into the living room. He looked at the couch where he sat every night. Then he looked at the photo of Margaret at the baseball game. She was grinning in that picture. Happy. Alive. Would she want him to spend the rest of his life frozen in this moment? Refusing to move forward? Refusing to feel anything but loss? Or would she want what Jason's mother had apparently wanted? For the people who loved her to find a way back to joy? Steve didn't have an answer. But for the first time in 2 years, he was asking the question. The next week, David arrived alone. Steve found himself disappointed. He hadn't realized how much he'd been anticipating seeing Jason again until the boy wasn't there. The house felt quieter than usual, heavier. He went through his appointments mechanically, barely registering where they went or why. On Friday, David mentioned that Jason had a school field trip that week. He asked me to tell you hello, David added. He's been talking non-stop about your house and the Cubs picture. Has he? Steve felt something warm flicker in his chest. Yes, sir. I hope he wasn't too intrusive. I've spoken to him about boundaries. He was fine, David. Actually, Steve hesitated. If you need to bring him again, it's all right. I don't mind. David's eyebrows rose slightly. I appreciate that, Mr. Harrison. Thank you. The following Thursday, Jason was back. This time, Steve had thought ahead. When they returned to the estate after the morning appointments, he invited them in without pretense. Mrs. Chen made cookies, he said. Chocolate chip. I thought Jason might like some. Jason's face lit up. Really? Thank you. They sat in the kitchen again. And this time Steve stayed instead of disappearing to his study. Mrs. Chen served warm cookies and milk, beaming at having people to fuss over. Mr. Harrison, Jason said between bites, can I ask you about baseball? What would you like to know? My grandma says the Cubs used to be really bad for a long time, but then they won. Is that true? Steve felt himself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in recent memory. That's very true. They went over 100 years without winning the World Series. 100 years. Wow. Why did people still like them if they lost so much? That's a good question. I think people loved them because they were their team. Win or lose, they were family. And when you love something, you don't give up on it just because things are hard. Jason nodded thoughtfully. Like how my dad didn't give up on me when I was really sad after my mom died, even when I was being difficult and mean sometimes. David looked at his son with tender surprise. You were never mean, buddy. You were just hurting. I was mean sometimes, Jason insisted. I yelled at you. I said I hated everything. But you stayed patient. That's what love does, David said softly. Steve watched this exchange, feeling something crack wider in his chest. This father and son, who had been through their own tragedy, had found a way to hold on to each other. They had chosen connection over isolation. Mr. Harrison, Jason's voice pulled him back. Did you watch the 2016 World Series when they finally won? I did. With my wife, Margaret. We watched every game together. Was it amazing? Steve closed his eyes, remembering. It was one of the best nights of my life. When they won, we jumped up and down in this living room like kids. We called our children. We called our friends. Margaret cried. I cried. Then we stayed up all night watching the highlights over and over, eating ice cream straight from the container. That sounds perfect, Jason said wistfully. It was. Steve's voice caught. She wore her Cubs cap the whole time, even to bed that night. She said she wanted to sleep in it so she'd dream about the game. Jason grinned. I do that sometimes, with my cap. Grandma says I'm going to squish it. Margaret did squish hers. I bought her a new one, but she refused to wear it. She said the old one had history. I get that. This one has history too. It was at the last Cubs game my mom ever went to before she died. Grandma saved it for me. Steve looked at this child who somehow understood the sacred weight of objects that carry memories. Jason, would you like to see something? Sure. Steve led them to a room he hadn't opened in months, what Margaret had called her hobby room. It was where she had kept her collectibles, her craft supplies, her personal treasures. He unlocked the door, and Jason gasped. The room was full of baseball memorabilia, signed baseballs in display cases, framed jerseys, championship pennants, photos from games they'd attended over the years. Whoa, this is like a museum. Your wife collected all this? David asked, looking around in amazement. We collected it together, Steve corrected. Every piece has a story. That baseball was from the first Cubs game we ever went to together. That jersey was from the playoff game, where we got caught in the rain but stayed anyway. Those pennants are from every season we had tickets. Jason moved carefully around the room, looking but not touching, respecting the sacred nature of these objects. Mr. Harrison, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Does it make you sad to look at this stuff? Steve considered the question honestly. Yes, but also, it makes me remember being happy. And I've been so focused on avoiding the sadness that I forgot that memories can be both things at once. Jason nodded sagely. Yeah, my therapist says that all the time. She says feelings can be mixed up together. They spent an hour in that room, Steve telling stories about different items. The baseball from the game where Margaret caught a foul ball and refused to give it back to a teenager who claimed he touched it first. The photograph of them wearing matching jerseys on their 20th anniversary. The ticket stub from the World Series game they'd attended in person, paying an absurd amount of money, but agreeing it was worth every penny. As Steve talked, he realized he was laughing. Actually laughing. Sharing not just the objects, but the joy they represented. When it was time for David and Jason to leave, Jason hugged Steve impulsively. Thank you for showing me your special room. Maybe next time I can show you my room. I have some space stuff that's pretty cool. Steve, startled by the hug, found himself patting the boy's back awkwardly. I'd like that. After they left, Steve sat in Margaret's hobby room for a long time. The memories here weren't different than they'd been an hour ago, but somehow, sharing them had changed how they felt. Less like anchors pulling him down, more like treasures worth protecting. That night, Steve didn't sit in his usual spot on the couch. He sat on Margaret's side instead. And he let himself cry. Really cry. For the first time since the funeral. Not the numb, hollow grief he'd been carrying, but the kind of crying that comes with actually feeling something. The kind that hurts terribly, but also somehow starts to heal. A child had walked into his life wearing a baseball cap, and slowly, impossibly, that child was teaching him how to be human again. Over the next month, Jason's visits became regular. David would bring him every Thursday, and Steve found himself planning for it. He asked Mrs. Chen to prepare Jason's favorite snacks. He queued up baseball documentaries they could watch together. He even ordered a new baseball encyclopedia he thought the boy would enjoy. His children noticed the change during their weekly calls. Dad, you sound different, Sarah said during one video chat. More energized. I suppose I am, Steve admitted. What changed? Steve wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you tell your adult children that a 10-year-old boy had succeeded where they had failed? Not because they hadn't tried, but because Jason's approach had been entirely different. Jason didn't try to fix Steve. Didn't push him to move on or let go. He simply existed alongside Steve's grief with an acceptance that was profound in its simplicity. I've been spending time with David's son, Steve said finally. The boy I mentioned who comes along sometimes. He's been good company. Michael, on the call too, looked pleased. That's great, Dad, really great. We've been worried about you isolating yourself. I know you have. And I'm sorry I've been so resistant. You don't need to apologize, Sarah said gently. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. We just want you to be okay. I'm working on it. And he was. Slowly, incrementally, but genuinely. The breakthrough came on a Thursday in early June. Jason arrived wearing his usual cap, but he looked subdued. David shot Steve an apologetic glance. Tough day at school, David explained quietly. His class did presentations about family history. It brought up some stuff about his mom. Steve understood immediately. Jason, would you like to talk about it? Jason shrugged, staring at his shoes. It's dumb. It's not dumb. They sat in the living room, and slowly Jason opened up. Everyone was talking about their families, showing old pictures, talking about traditions and stuff. And I started talking about my mom, about how we used to watch Cubs games together. And then I just started crying, right there in front of everyone. Did anyone make fun of you? No. Everyone was nice. But I felt stupid. It's been 3 years. I should be over it by now. Steve felt his heart crack. Jason, look at me. The boy raised his eyes, red-rimmed and watery. You will never be over it, Steve said firmly. Your mother was important to you. She shaped who you are. Missing her isn't something you get over. It's something you carry with you. And some days it's heavier than others. Really? Really, I've been carrying grief for 2 years, and some days I think I've made progress. And then something small happens and it hits me all over again. That's not weakness. That's love. Jason's lip quivered. I miss her so much sometimes. I try to be happy like everyone wants me to be, but today I just couldn't. Then today you're sad, and that's okay. My dad says Mom would want me to be happy. I'm sure she would, but she would also understand that happiness isn't something you can force. It comes and goes. Some days you have it, some days you don't. The trick is not judging yourself for the days when you don't. David was watching this exchange with quiet tears in his eyes. Jason wiped his nose with his sleeve. Is that what you've been doing? Trying to force yourself not to be sad? Steve exhaled slowly. Yes. For a long time, I thought if I avoided everything that reminded me of my wife, I would stop hurting. But you can't avoid grief. It follows you everywhere. The only way through it is, well, through it. Did I help, even a little? Steve smiled. Jason, you helped more than you know. You showed me that it's possible to honor someone's memory and still live your own life. You showed me that sadness and joy can exist together. You wore that cap not to hide from your grief, but to carry your mother with you while you move forward. That's braver than anything I've done. Jason finally smiled, small but genuine. Thanks, Mr. Harrison. They spent the rest of the afternoon watching a Cubs game from the previous season. Steve ordered pizza, something he hadn't done in years. They ate in the living room, shouting at the TV, critiquing plays, debating strategy. For a few hours, the house was alive again. When evening came and it was time for David and Jason to leave, Jason paused at the door. Mr. Harrison, can I ask you something serious? Of course. Are you going to be okay? Like, really okay? Steve considered lying, giving the easy answer. But Jason deserved better. I don't know yet, Steve admitted. But I'm trying, and I think trying is enough for now. Jason nodded. My therapist would agree with that. After they left, Steve walked through his house, really looked at it for the first time in months. The rooms full of memories didn't seem quite as haunted anymore. The silence didn't press quite as heavily. Margaret was still gone. That hadn't changed. But maybe Steve didn't have to be gone too. He walked to Margaret's hobby room and picked up one of the signed baseballs, rolling it in his hands. I'm trying, Maggie, he whispered to the empty room. I'm really trying. And somewhere, in whatever way the dead communicate with the living, he felt like she heard him. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. David's phone lit up in the darkness, the ringtone jarring him awake. He fumbled for it, heart pounding with the primal fear that comes with middle-of-the-night calls. "Hello? Mr. Porter, this is St. Mary's Hospital. We have Mr. Stephen Harrison here. You're listed as his emergency contact for non-family." David sat bolt upright. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He's stable now, but he collapsed at home. His housekeeper found him and called 911. He's asking for you." "I'll be right there." David threw on clothes, mind racing. He called Rita, explained the situation, asked if she could come stay with Jason. She arrived within 20 minutes, and David was out the door. The hospital was 40 minutes away. David broke several speed limits getting there. He found Steve in the emergency room, looking smaller and frailer than David had ever seen him. Pale, connected to monitors, an IV in his arm. "Mr. Harrison," David breathed, relieved to see him conscious. "David." Steve's voice was weak. "I'm sorry to wake you." "Don't apologize. What happened?" A doctor stepped in, introducing herself as Dr. Patel. "Mr. Harrison had a severe anxiety attack that triggered cardiac symptoms. We've run tests. His heart is structurally fine, but his body is under significant stress. His blood pressure is dangerously high, and he's severely underweight. Frankly, he's not taking care of himself." Steve closed his eyes. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Dr. Patel said firmly. "You collapsed. If your housekeeper hadn't found you, this could have been much worse. I'm recommending at least a 2-day observation period, and then I want you to start therapy, both physical and mental health. This level of stress will kill you if you don't address it." After the doctor left, David pulled a chair close to the bed. "Mr. Harrison, Steve, please just call me Steve." "Steve, what happened tonight?" Steve's face crumpled. "I was sitting in the living room, same as always, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my heart was racing. I thought I was having a heart attack. I managed to call Mrs. Chen before I passed out." "Have you been feeling stressed?" "I've been feeling stressed for 2 years, Steve said bitterly. "But tonight, I don't know. Something about the emptiness of it all just crashed down on me. The realization that I could die in that house, and it would be days before anyone found me. That I've pushed everyone away so effectively that I'm completely alone." "You're not alone. You have your children, who live on different continents. You have me, David. That's as close to family as I've got right now." David felt the weight of that statement. "What about Jason? He's become quite attached to you." Steve's expression softened. "Jason? Yes, that boy has been—" He trailed off, emotion overwhelming him. "He's been showing me that life is still possible. And tonight, lying on my floor, unable to breathe, all I could think about was that I might die without ever truly living again, without honoring what Margaret would have wanted for me." "What would she have wanted?" "For me to be happy, to connect with people, to not waste whatever time I have left locked in grief." Steve looked at David directly. "Your son has been teaching me things I should have learned on my own, and tonight made me realize I can't keep doing this alone." David squeezed Steve's shoulder. "Then don't. Let people in. Let us help." "I don't know how." "You start by letting your housekeeper cook meals you actually eat. By calling your children more than once a week. By maybe saying yes when Jason asks if he can visit outside of work hours." Steve managed a weak smile. "He asked that?" "Last week. He wanted to know if he could come visit you on Saturday to show you his science project." I told him we shouldn't impose, but he's been asking every day since. Tell him yes. Steve, tell him yes, Steve repeated with more strength. I want him to visit. I want to stop being alone. David felt his eyes water. Okay, I'll tell him. They sat in silence for a while, just the beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. David, Steve said eventually, can I ask you something? Anything. How did you do it? After your wife died, how did you keep going? How did you not just give up? David thought carefully before answering. I had Jason. He needed me. But even beyond that, Keisha and I were divorced. But she was still the mother of my child, still someone I had loved once. And I realized that the best way to honor her was to make sure Jason grew up knowing he was loved, that life could still be good, that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. I don't have anyone who needs me, Steve said quietly. That's not true. Jason needs you. Maybe not in a survival way, but in a you make his life richer way. And your children need you. And whether you realize it or not, I've come to need these Thursday visits. They've given me hope that good people can find their way back from tragedy. Steve gripped David's hand. Thank you for coming, for being here. Where else would I be? When visiting hours were over, David finally headed home. But not before promising Steve he would be back in the morning. At home, Jason was still awake despite Rita's efforts to put him to bed. Dad, is Mr. Harrison okay? David knelt beside his son. He's going to be, but he had a scary night. He's realized that he needs to start taking better care of himself. Can we visit him? Soon, buddy. Let's give him a couple of days to rest first. Jason's face fell. I want to give him something, to make him feel better. Like what? Jason ran to his room and returned with a drawing. It was Steve and Jason at a baseball game, both wearing Cubs caps, both smiling. Jason had labeled it, My Friend Mr. Harrison, in his careful handwriting. David felt his throat tighten. This is beautiful, buddy. I'll make sure he gets it. The next morning, David returned to the hospital with the drawing. Steve was sitting up, looking better but still weak. Jason made you something. David handed over the drawing. Steve stared at it, and then tears started rolling down his face. My friend, he whispered, reading the label. He called me his friend. You are his friend, and friends show up for each other. So whatever you need, Steve, while you're recovering and after, we're here. Steve wiped his eyes. I've been thinking all night about changes I need to make. The doctor wants me in therapy, and I'm going to do it. Really do it, not just go through the motions. And I want to start eating dinner with Mrs. Chen instead of hiding in my room. And I want to call my children and tell them I love them and I'm sorry for shutting them out. Those sound like good steps. And I want to repay you and Jason somehow. For what you've given me. You don't owe us anything. I do. You gave me my life back. You reminded me that connection is worth the risk of pain. That's not something I can ever repay, but I can try. Steve looked at the drawing again, at the simple joy Jason had captured in crayon and paper. When I get out of here, I want to do something special for Jason. Take him to a real Cubs game. Just the three of us. Would that be all right? David smiled. He would love that. He's been wanting to go to a real game his whole life. Then it's a date, as soon as I'm cleared by the doctors. Steve had nearly died in his empty living room, crushed by loneliness and unprocessed grief. But now, holding a child's drawing and planning a future that included other people, He was finally beginning to live again. Steve came home from the hospital on a Thursday, insisting that David and Jason be there when he arrived. Jason ran up the driveway the moment the car pulled in, carrying a balloon that said, "Welcome home," and a plate of cookies he and Rita had baked. "Mr. Harrison, you're back," Steve, still moving slowly but looking significantly better, smiled genuinely. "Thanks to you, I think." They went inside, where Mrs. Chen had prepared a full dinner. The first real meal Steve had shown interest in eating in months. She had set the table in the dining room, not the kitchen breakfast nook, and Steve had made an unusual request. He wanted everyone to eat together. "Mrs. Chen, please join us. And David, Jason, of course you too." Mrs. Chen looked shocked. "Mr. Harrison, I couldn't. Please. This house has been empty too long. I need it to feel like a home again." So they all sat down together. An odd, makeshift family at a table built for 16. Steve at the head, Jason to his right, David and Mrs. Chen on either side. Jason kept the conversation flowing, talking about his science project, a volcano that had erupted all over his grandmother's kitchen, his upcoming school talent show, he was doing magic tricks, and his friend Tyler's new pet hamster, named Sir Squeaks-a-Lot. Steve laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite chuckle he'd been offering for months, but real, genuine laughter that came from somewhere deep. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Jason immediately gravitated to the spot where Steve usually sat alone. "Can we watch a game?" Jason asked hopefully. Steve turned on the television, finding a Cubs game in progress. They watched together, Jason asking questions, Steve explaining the nuances of baseball strategy, David adding his own commentary. This was what the living room had been built for, Steve realized. Not as a museum for grief, but as a gathering place. A space where people connected, argued about sports, ate too many snacks, and simply existed together. Over the following weeks, Thursday dinners became a tradition. Sometimes Rita joined them. Sometimes it was just the four of them. But the living room was never empty anymore on Thursday nights. Steve also made other changes. He started therapy with a grief counselor recommended by Dr. Patel. The first session was brutal, facing everything he'd been avoiding for 2 years. But his therapist, a woman named Dr. Brooks, was patient and firm. "Grief isn't something you get over," she told him. "It's something you integrate into your life. Your wife was important to you. That doesn't end just because she's no longer physically present. Then how do I move forward? You find ways to honor her memory while also living your own life. You allow yourself to feel joy without guilt. You understand that loving her and loving your remaining time on Earth aren't mutually exclusive." It was exactly what Jason had been trying to teach him all along. Steve also started calling Michael and Sarah more frequently, really talking to them, not just exchanging pleasantries. He told them about David and Jason, about the Thursday dinners, about starting to feel like himself again. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," Sarah said, tears in her voice. "I know this hasn't been easy." "It hasn't. But I'm trying. Your mother would want me to try." She absolutely would. One Saturday afternoon, Steve did something he hadn't done since Margaret's death. He went to the baseball card shop they used to visit together. Jason accompanied him, bouncing with excitement. They spent 2 hours looking through cards, with Steve teaching Jason about different players, different eras, what made certain cards valuable. "This one," Steve said, pulling out a vintage Ernie Banks card. was your mother's favorite player. Mr. Cub, they called him. Can I get one? I'll buy it for you. Jason's eyes went wide. Really? Really? Consider it a late welcome to friendship gift. In the car on the way home, Jason said quietly, Mr. Harrison, you seem happier now. I am happier. Thanks to you. I didn't do anything special. You did everything special, Jason. You showed up. You were yourself. You didn't try to fix me. You just let me be broken until I was ready to start healing. That's the most special thing anyone has ever done for me. Jason looked out the window, processing this. Then he said, my mom used to say that sometimes people just need to know someone cares, that you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to show up. Your mother was a wise woman. Yeah, she was. When Steve got home that evening, he sat in the living room, not in his usual spot, but in Margaret's. He pulled out his phone and looked at pictures of her. Really looked at them for the first time in months. Her smile at their wedding. Her laughing on a beach vacation. Her wearing that Cubs cap at a game. Sunburned and happy. The pain was still there. It would always be there. But alongside the pain was something else now. Gratitude. Love. And a growing sense that Margaret's legacy wasn't the grief she left behind, but the love she had brought into his life. And that love could continue, could expand, could include new people. A driver who had become a friend. A child who had become a teacher. A housekeeper who had become family. The living room wasn't empty anymore. And neither was Steve. The Cubs tickets arrived in the mail on a Wednesday. Steve had pulled strings, called in old favors, and managed to get 3 premium seats for a Saturday afternoon game in July. When he showed them to Jason and David that Thursday, Jason literally screamed with joy. We're really going to Wrigley Field? For real? For real, Steve confirmed, grinning at the boy's excitement. Dad, we're going to a Cubs game, an actual game. David laughed, pulling his son into a hug. I heard, buddy. We'll have to get you a new cap for the occasion. No way I'm wearing Mom's cap. She needs to be there too. Steve felt his eyes sting. I think that's perfect. Saturday arrived with perfect baseball weather. Sunny, 75 degrees with a light breeze. They drove to Chicago together, Jason bouncing in the back seat the entire 2-hour drive, asking a million questions about the stadium, the team, the players, the food, everything. When Wrigley Field came into view, Jason pressed his face to the window in awe. It's so big. Just wait until you see the inside, Steve promised. They got hot dogs, peanuts, and sodas. Found their seats, which were incredible, right behind home plate with a perfect view of the entire field. The stadium was packed, the crowd buzzing with pre-game energy. Jason wore his mother's cap and a new Cubs jersey Steve had bought him as a surprise. He looked happier than David had ever seen him. When the national anthem played, Jason stood at attention, hand over his heart, his face serious and respectful. Steve noticed David watching his son with pride and love so profound, it was almost tangible. This was a father who had chosen to keep showing up, keep trying, keep loving, even when everything was hard. Steve felt honored to witness it. The game was incredible. The Cubs were playing the Cardinals, their historic rivals, and the competition was fierce. Every play mattered. Every pitch was analyzed by the crowd. Every hit brought roars of approval or groans of disappointment. Jason was fully invested, shouting at the umpires, cheering for home runs, gasping at close plays. He kept a running commentary that made both Steve and David laugh. "Did you see that? That was clearly a ball. Come on, ref, I mean umpire, that was fair. Dad, did you see how fast he ran? That was amazing." In the 7th inning, during the stretch, the entire stadium stood to sing, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Jason sang along, off-key but enthusiastic, and Steve found himself singing too, something he hadn't done since Margaret's death. The Cubs won 4-2 with a walk-off home run in the bottom of the 9th. The stadium erupted. Strangers hugged. Jason jumped up and down, screaming. And Steve felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Walking back to the car after the game, Jason said, "That was the best day of my entire life." "Mine too," Steve agreed, and meant it. "Can we come back? Please?" "Absolutely. We'll make it a tradition." David put his hand on Steve's shoulder. "Thank you for everything. This meant more to Jason than you know. It meant more to me than you know. You two have given me back my life." That night, after dropping David and Jason at home, Steve returned to his mansion. But it didn't feel like a mansion anymore. It felt like a house, a home even. He walked through the rooms, seeing them differently now. Not as monuments to the past, but as spaces with potential for future memories. The living room where they would watch more games. The dining room where they would share more meals. The hobby room where he could teach Jason about baseball history. Michael called that evening for their weekly chat. "How was the game, Dad?" "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." "Michael, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I'm not going to move overseas. I know you and Sarah want me closer, and I love you both for that. But this is my home, and I finally figured out how to live in it again." There was a pause. Then Michael said, "I understand, Dad, as long as you're not alone." "I'm not alone. I have friends here now, a different kind of family, and I need you to know that your mother would have loved them. She would have loved how Jason talks non-stop about baseball and science. She would have loved David's quiet loyalty. She would have loved how Mrs. Chen fusses over all of us. I believe that. Mom always loved a full house. She did. And I'm working on filling it again. Not replacing what we had, but building something new alongside it." After hanging up, Steve sat in the living room, in Margaret's spot, where he'd been sitting more often lately. He pulled out his phone and looked at her pictures again. But this time, he also looked at the new pictures he'd been taking. Jason with his Cubs jersey, David grilling in the backyard, Mrs. Chen laughing at dinner. Both sets of photos mattered. Both were part of his story. Margaret's voice came to him, not as an auditory hallucination, but as a memory so clear it felt like presence. "Live your life, Steve. Don't waste it grieving for me. Love people. Fill our home with laughter. That's how you honor me." "I'm trying, Maggie," he whispered. "I'm really trying." The next Thursday, when David and Jason arrived, Steve had a surprise waiting. He had transformed part of the garage into a game room. A pool table, a dartboard, a small kitchenette with a mini fridge stocked with sodas, comfortable chairs, a TV, and Cubs memorabilia on the walls. "I thought we needed a dedicated space for hanging out," Steve explained. "The living room is great, but this is just for us. Our space." Jason was speechless, walking around with wide eyes. "This is so cool." "And Jason," Steve continued, pulling out a wrapped box, "I have something else for you." Jason tore into the wrapping paper and found a vintage Cubs cap inside. Not just any cap, but an authentic 1908 World Series replica, the last time the Cubs had won before 2016. "This is for you," Steve said. "Your mother's cap is precious, and you should keep wearing it. But I thought you might like your own too, so you can carry both memories, your mother's and the ones we're making together." Jason's eyes filled with tears. He launched himself at Steve, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Steve hugged him back, no longer awkward or hesitant. This was family now. Not the family he'd been born into or married into, but the family he'd chosen. The family that had chosen him back. David watched the scene with tears streaming down his face. "You've given us so much," he said to Steve. "I don't know how to thank you." "You gave me my life back," Steve replied simply. "That's thanks enough." They spent the evening in the new game room. Steve taught Jason how to play pool, laughing as the balls went everywhere except where they were supposed to. They played darts, ate too much pizza, and watched highlights from classic Cubs games. As the evening wound down and David and Jason prepared to leave, Jason asked, "Mr. Harrison, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When my mom died, I thought I would never be happy again. I thought the sad feeling would last forever. But then I met you, and you showed me that even grown-ups can be really sad and then get better. That helped me understand that it's okay to still be sad sometimes, but it's also okay to be happy. So thank you for being sad with me and getting better with me." Steve knelt down to Jason's level. "Thank you for being patient with me, and for teaching an old man that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story." They hugged again, and Steve realized that this 10-year-old had accomplished something extraordinary, not by trying to fix him, not by pushing him to move on, but simply by showing up with an oversized baseball cap and an open heart. The annual Cubs opening day had become sacred in the Harrison household. Yes, household, because that's what it had become. David had moved into the guest house on the property a year ago, after Steve had insisted he stop paying rent on his cramped apartment. "I have space you're not using," Steve had argued. "And Jason spends half his time here anyway. Just make it official." Mrs. Chen now had 2 dinner settings as her default: the breakfast nook for quick meals, and the dining room for their Thursday family dinners that had expanded to include Rita, David's mother, and sometimes Jason's friends from school. The living room was never empty. Currently, it was full of people preparing for their annual opening day party. Jason, now 12 and taller, was setting up folding chairs. David was arranging food on the kitchen island. Rita was hanging Cubs banners. Mrs. Chen was pulling fresh cookies from the oven. And Steve, now 67 but looking 10 years younger than he had 2 years ago, was standing in Margaret's hobby room with Michael and Sarah, who had flown in for the celebration. "Dad, this place looks exactly the same," Sarah said, looking around at the memorabilia. "It should. It's a museum to your mother's passion. But now it's a living museum. Jason and I come in here all the time. We add new pieces. We tell stories. We keep her memory alive by sharing it." Michael picked up one of the signed baseballs. "I'm glad you didn't pack everything away. And I'm glad you didn't move." "I was wrong about a lot of things," Steve admitted. "I thought holding on to the house meant holding on to grief, but you can hold on to memories without drowning in sadness. You just need people around you to remind you how." "This David and Jason have been good for you," Sarah observed. "They saved my life, literally and figuratively." Back in the living room, more people were arriving. Marcus, David's friend who had given him advice about the job years ago, some of Mrs. Chen's family, a few neighbors Steve had finally started talking to, and walking through the door, wearing his mother's original cap and the vintage one Steve had given him, was Jason. "Mr. Harrison, we are going to destroy the Cardinals today." "From your mouth to the baseball god's ears," Steve laughed. The game started with everyone crowded into the living room, sitting on couches, chairs, floor cushions. The noise was incredible. Cheering, groaning, arguing about calls, laughing at commercials. This was what Margaret had wanted. This was what the house had been built for. During the 7th inning stretch, as "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" played on the TV, everyone stood and sang. Jason grabbed Steve's hand on one side and David's on the other, swaying to the music. Steve looked around at the faces in his living room. His children, visiting from across the world. David, who had become the brother he'd never had. Jason, who had become something between a grandson and a guardian angel. Mrs. Chen and Rita, arguing good-naturedly about whose cookies were better. The house that had once held only silence and grief now overflowed with life. After the game, a Cubs victory, people lingered, not wanting the day to end. Steve found himself in the kitchen with David, washing dishes while everyone else watched highlights in the living room. "David, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "I want to set up college funds for Jason, and I want to revise my will to include you and Jason as beneficiaries. Not to the exclusion of my children, they're taken care of, but to ensure you're taken care of too." David stopped washing the dish in his hand. "Steve, you don't need to." "I do need to. Your family. This is what family does." "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me do this. Say you'll keep showing up on Thursdays. Say you'll keep letting Jason teach me about joy and resilience. That's payment enough." David pulled Steve into a hug. "Deal." That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Steve walked through the rooms one more time. The living room still smelled like popcorn and cookies. The dining room table still had crumbs from the celebration. The hobby room still held Margaret's treasures, now shared with new friends. He stopped at the photo of Margaret at the baseball game, the one that had been sitting on the side table for years. "We did it, Aggie," he said softly. "The house is full again. Not the same as when you were here, but full in a different way. I think you'd like them. David's solid and kind. Jason's brilliant and funny. Mrs. Chen makes terrible puns. Rita tells embarrassing stories. It's chaotic and loud and imperfect and wonderful." He paused, imagining her response. She would have loved it. She would have loved all of it. "I miss you every day," he continued. "That hasn't changed. But I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living, and I know that's what you wanted." He thought he felt something then. Not a ghost, not a supernatural presence, but a sense of peace, of approval, of love that transcended death. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, a text from Jason. "Thanks for the best opening day ever. See you Thursday for dinner. I want to show you my history project about Jackie Robinson." Steve smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Sweet dreams, kiddo." He turned off the lights in the living room, but he didn't feel the usual dread of going upstairs to an empty bedroom, because the house wasn't empty anymore, and neither was he. Steve Harrison had learned something profound in the 2 years since a child walked into his living room wearing a baseball cap. Grief doesn't have an expiration date. Loss doesn't have a timeline. Missing someone doesn't mean you've failed to move on. But grief can coexist with joy. Loss can coexist with new love. Missing someone can coexist with building new connections. The living room that had once been a monument to loneliness had become a gathering place for a family that didn't look like any traditional definition of the word. A wealthy widower, a single father, a boy who had lost his mother but not his hope, a housekeeper who became a confidant, a grandmother who became a fixture, children who called from overseas but knew their father was finally okay. They weren't related by blood. They hadn't known each other long. They had no legal obligation to each other. But they were family in the way that mattered most. They chose each other, showed up for each other, and filled each other's empty spaces with love. Steve had spent 2 years believing that avoiding connection would protect him from pain. But a 10-year-old boy had taught him the truth. Connection is worth the risk. Love is worth the vulnerability. Living is worth the grief that inevitably comes with it. Because at the end of the day, we're not remembered for how much money we accumulated, or how big our houses were, or how successfully we avoided pain. We're remembered for the people we loved, the lives we touched, the living rooms we filled with laughter. Steve Harrison had almost died alone in an empty mansion, his grief consuming him from the inside out. But a child wearing an oversized baseball cap had pulled him back from the edge, not with grand gestures or therapeutic interventions, but with simple, persistent, unwavering presence. By showing up, by asking questions, by sharing his own loss without shame, by teaching an old man that happiness and sadness aren't opposites, they're companions on the same journey. And now, 2 years later, Steve's living room was never empty. His dining table was never quiet. His heart was never closed. He still missed Margaret every single day, but he honored her memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted for him. One filled with baseball games, found family, terrible puns, burnt cookies, and the beautiful chaos of people who love each other. The house that had been built for love had been empty for too long. But now, it was full again. And Steve Harrison, wealthy, widowed, once utterly alone, had finally come home. Not to a place, but to a life worth living. All because a driver's son filled his empty living room with laughter and taught him that grief is just love with nowhere to go, until you find new places for it to land.